late 1943. 28000 feet over the frozen heart of the Reich. The twin-boomed P-38 Lightnings carved through the thin, merciless air, their crystal-clear contrails, a bold statement of American power. For Lieutenant Miller flying escort for the lumbering B-17 seconds, the mission felt routine until it wasn't. A violent shudder ripped through his airframe, not from enemy fire, but from within. His left Allison engine coughed, sputtered, and then died, vomiting a plume of black, greasy smoke into the stratosphere. The sleek Interceptor, a machine built to dominate at high altitude, suddenly became a coffin of cold steel. The stick went dead in his hands, the aircraft yawing uncontrollably as it lost speed and altitude with terrifying speed. Through his canopy, Miller saw the Sharks circling the Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds of the Luftwaffe, peeling off to pounce on the wounded straggler. Pure, cold dread flooded his veins. His enemy wasn't just the German pilot closing in for the kill. It was his own magnificent, fatally flawed machine. The Germans called the P-38 the fork-tailed devil, a name meant to inspire fear. Yet up here in the one environment it was born to conquer, the Lightning was betraying its pilots with lethal consistency. This was the tragic paradox of America's most advanced fighter in Europe, a thoroughbred brought to its knees not by enemy guns, but by the very air it breathed. This is the story of its near demise and the desperate engineering race against time that transformed a hangar queen into the high-altitude predator it was always meant to be, forever changing the air war over Germany. The terror Lieutenant Miller felt as his P-38 tore itself apart high above Germany was not a freak accident. It was not a singular tragic failure of man or machine. It was a symptom of a deep cancerous flaw that was spreading through the American fighter groups in Europe like a plague. His horrifying ordeal was being echoed in cockpits across the 8th Air Force, a ghost in the machine that haunted every pilot who climbed above 200,000 feet. The sleek, futuristic fighter, America's answer to the Luftwaffe's high-altitude aces, was systematically killing its own men. The fork-tailed devil was devouring its masters, and no one could figure out why. On the ground, after-action reports became a litany of mechanical horror. Pilots described engines running rough, vibrating so violently that instruments blurred into illegibility. They spoke of sudden, inexplicable backfires that sounded like cannon shots inside the engine cowlings, followed by erratic surges and drops in power. Temperature gauges would swing wildly into the red for no reason, forcing pilots into desperate dives towards thicker, warmer air. And then there was the silence, the sudden stomach-dropping cessation of a 1600 horsepower Allison V1710, replaced only by the shriek of the wind over the canopy and the frantic pounding beat of the pilot's own heart. The trust between man and machine, the most sacred bond in aerial combat, was broken. Back in the United States, the frantic reports from England baffled the engineers at Lockheed and Allison. They were aghast. The very same P-38 models, the Fs and early Gs, were performing spectacularly in the Pacific theater. Over the steaming jungles of New Guinea and the warm waters of the Solomon Islands, the Lightning was a god of the skies, feared by the Japanese for its speed, firepower, and ruggedness. There, the Allisons ran like clockwork. The mystery deepened, creating a chasm of confusion between the factories in California and the frozen airfields of England. It wasn't the engine itself. It wasn't a fundamental design flaw in the airframe. The culprit was more insidious. It was the environment itself, the brutal, unforgiving cold of the European stratosphere, an enemy the designers had tragically underestimated. The heart of the P-38's high-altitude prowess was its brilliant General Electric turbo supercharger system. In essence, these were the fighter's lungs. At altitudes where the air was too thin for a conventional engine to breathe, the turbo superchargers used the engine's own hot exhaust gases to spin a turbine at incredible speeds. This turbine, in turn, drove a compressor that force-fed dense pressurized air back into the engine, allowing it to maintain its sea-level power far into the heavens. But there was a catch: compressing air heats it up dramatically. Pumping superheated air into an engine cylinder would cause the fuel to ignite prematurely, a catastrophic event known as detonation. To solve this, the P-38 was equipped with intercoolers, sophisticated radiators that cooled the hot compressed air back down to an optimal temperature before it entered the engine. This entire complex, delicate system was the key to the Lightning's performance, a marvel of engineering that gave it life in the void. But in the negative 60-degree Fahrenheit temperatures above Europe, this marvel became the aircraft's Achilles heel. The intercoolers designed to cool hot air were now being blasted by an Arctic vortex. The system was thrown into chaos. The automatic regulators, which controlled the flow of air and temperature, couldn't cope with the extreme thermal differential. They would hunt and surge, unable to maintain a stable intake temperature. Worse, the moisture present in the compressed air would flash freeze inside the induction system, creating internal blockages of ice. The engine's lungs were being choked and frozen shut. The air reaching the cylinders was either too cold to properly mix with fuel, or its temperature was fluctuating so wildly that the carburetor couldn't deliver a stable mixture. The end result was detonation. Instead of a controlled, powerful burn pushing the piston down, the unstable air-fuel mixture would explode violently and prematurely, like a sledgehammer blow against the top of the piston. These were not minor misfires. They were savage internal explosions that sent shockwaves through the entire engine. Connecting rods would snap, pistons would shatter, and entire cylinder heads would crack under the strain. This was what Lieutenant Miller had felt the death throes of a precision machine being hammered to pieces from the inside out. He wasn't shot down. His own engine had committed suicide. The tactical consequences were catastrophic. P-38 groups were suffering availability rates below 50%. More Lightnings were being lost to non-combat mechanical failures than were being shot down by Fu 190 seconds and Bf 109 seconds. Bomber crews who had once cheered at the sight of the twin-boomed escorts now watched with dread as their little friends would suddenly peel away from the formation, one engine trailing smoke, leaving a gaping hole in their defensive screen. The entire strategic bombing campaign, which hinged on the ability of long-range fighters to protect the bombers all the way to the target and back, was now in jeopardy. For the pilots, the psychological toll was immense. Confidence in their aircraft, the single most important factor for a fighter pilot, was shattered. Each pre-flight check was filled with anxiety, each climb to altitude a gamble. They were elite warriors trained to face a skilled enemy, but their most unpredictable and deadly foe was the very machine they were strapped into. Command lost faith. The P-38, the heralded long-range champion, was quietly and humiliatingly withdrawn from high-altitude bomber escort duties, relegated to medium-altitude fighter sweeps and ground attack roles, where its fatal flaw was less likely to manifest. For the men of the 8th Air Force, the fork-tailed devil had fallen from grace, a broken angel plummeting from the sky. While the P-38's reputation was dying in the frozen skies over Europe, its ghost haunted the sun-drenched engineering halls of Lockheed in Burbank, California. The after-action reports arrived not as data but as eulogies. Each cable from England was an indictment, a cryptic message detailing the final moments of a machine that the men in Burbank had considered their masterpiece. They were the world's best aeronautical engineers, yet they had become unwilling coroners performing long-distance autopsies on their own creation. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight of national urgency and personal failure. Every day they delayed another pilot, like Miller, might fall from the sky, betrayed by the very technology designed to keep him safe. The initial theories were a frantic scattershot of possibilities. Was it a bad batch of Allison engines sabotage? A subtle deficiency in British high-octane fuel? A team of the brightest minds from Lockheed Allison and General Electric was assembled, a brain trust born of desperation. They walled themselves off, poring over the fragmented, terrifying accounts from the front. They stared at engine schematics until the lines blurred, cross-referencing pilot testimony with performance charts. The breakthrough came from a single glaring paradox: the Pacific. The reports from General Kenny's 5th Air Force were glowing. The P-38 was a world-beater, a demon in the humid tropical air. The engineers seized on the one stark difference: the environment. It had to be the cold. But a theory was not a solution. They needed to see the failure to recreate the ghost in their own laboratory. In a secure facility, they constructed what amounted to a torture chamber for engines. A complete P-38 engine nacelle with its Allison V-1000, 710, and its intricate General Electric turbo supercharger system was mounted on a massive steel test stand. This test cell was then encased in a heavily insulated chamber, laced with refrigeration coils, capable of plunging the ambient temperature to the Arctic levels, found at 300,000 feet. Engineers, bundled in heavy parkas and gloves, stood behind triple-paned, frost-laced observation windows, their breath misting in the frigid air. This was their new battlefield. The first test run was a chilling success. They started the Allison, its familiar throaty roar filling the chamber. On their control panels, all gauges read green. Then they began the simulation. They spooled up the turbo supercharger, mimicking a climb to high altitude. Simultaneously, the refrigeration units kicked in, and the temperature in the chamber plummeted. -20, -40, -60 degrees Fahrenheit. For a moment the engine held. Then, exactly as the reports described, the nightmare began. A deep, resonant shudder vibrated through the concrete floor. The RPM needle began to hunt erratically. A sharp crack like a rifle shot echoed from the exhaust, a backfire. Then another. Through the observation window they watched the engine shake itself with savage violence until, with a final grinding shriek of protesting metal, it seized. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the freezing coils. They had captured the ghost. The post-mortem was immediate. With the engine still cold, they tore it down. The diagnosis was undeniable. The intercooler, the very device meant to regulate intake temperatures, had become a weapon of self-destruction. In the extreme cold, it was too efficient, chilling the compressed air far below optimal levels and causing ice to form deep within the induction system. The automatic regulators, designed for a far narrower range of temperatures, were thrown into a state of chaos, unable to compensate. Now came the race for a cure. The first proposed solution was a brute force approach, a more complex, manually controlled bypass for the intercooler. It was clumsy, added another critical task for pilots already overwhelmed in combat, and was rejected as too risky. Another idea involved using electrical heating elements, but the P-38's electrical system was already overburdened. The answer, when it came, was not one of brute force, but of sublime engineering elegance. It was a moment of quiet genius in a room full of slide rules and crumpled blueprints. An engineer, staring at the schematics for the 1,000th time, traced a line with his finger. The engine was already producing a massive amount of waste heat through its liquid coolant system, the very system that kept the engine from melting. What if they could harness that heat? The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of adding a new system, they would modify an existing one. They would tap into the hot glycol lines that ran from the engine to its main radiators in the boom. A new, smaller duct system would be fabricated, allowing the pilot to divert a controlled bleed of this scorching air and route it directly over the face of the intercooler and into the carburetor air intake. It was a closed-loop solution, using the engine's own destructive heat to save itself. It was the perfect countermeasure, a way to give the engine a warm breath in the coldest reaches of the sky. A team of mechanics worked feverishly, handcrafting the prototype parts. They called it the winterization kit. The modified engine was reassembled and mounted back in the Arctic test chamber. The mood was electric, with a mixture of hope and dread. Once more the test began. The engine roared to life, the turbo spooled up, the temperature plunged. The engineers held their breath, their eyes glued to the gauges. This time there was no shudder, no backfire. The RPM needle stayed rock steady. The Allison V-1710 sang a smooth, powerful, unbroken song of defiance against the cold. Inside the control room, a slow wave of triumphant smiles spread across the exhausted faces of the engineers. They hadn't just fixed a flaw, they had given the fork-tailed devil back its fire. Now, they just had to get it to the front lines before it was too late. The triumphant roar of the Allison engine in that frozen California test chamber was not an ending. It was the starting gun for a new, even more desperate race. A solution on a blueprint in Burbank was worthless to a pilot fighting for his life over Schweinfurt. The ghost had been identified, but now it had to be exorcised from every single P-38 inches, the European theatre of operations. What followed was a logistical miracle. a Herculean feat of industrial will that stretched from the factory floors of the West Coast to the muddy, windswept airfields of England. It was a race against the Atlantic, against the U-boats, and against the relentless operational clock of a war that waited for no machine and no man. The command went out, and the American industrial machine responded with a thunderous roar of its own. Blueprints for the winterization kit, a name that belied its life-or-death importance, were rushed into mass production. This wasn't a single simple part. It was an intricate puzzle of preformed duralumin ducts, high-pressure rubber hoses, specialized control valves, clamps, brackets, and rivets, thousands of them. Assembly lines once churning out fuselages and wings were retooled to produce these vital components. An army of workers who had never seen a dogfight or felt the biting cold at 3,000 feet now labored around the clock, their hands shaping the very instruments of salvation for men they would never meet. Each completed kit was carefully packed into large wooden crates, stenciled with urgent shipping codes, and rushed to the teeming ports of the East Coast. There they were loaded into the dark, cavernous holds of cargo ships, joining convoys that zigzagged across the treacherous North Atlantic. Every single crate represented a resurrected fighter, a pilot's renewed lease on life. And every shadow on the horizon, every sonar ping was a threat not just to the ship but to the entire strategic air war. The battle for the P-38 was now being fought by welders in California, dockworkers in New York, and the brave men of the merchant marine dodging wolf packs in the icy grey swells. As the first precious shipments arrived in the ports of Liverpool and Glasgow, another army was mobilized. On the sprawling air depots and forward operating bases across England, the ground crews, the unsung grease-stained heroes of the air war, prepared for the fight of their lives. These men were already exhausted, working in abysmal conditions. They toiled in freezing rain and ankle-deep mud, their hands raw and their fingers numb, their only light often coming from shielded lanterns under the perpetual blackout. They were used to patching bullet holes and swapping out fouled spark plugs. Now they were being asked to perform open-heart surgery on the most complex fighter aircraft in the world. The arrival of the crates was met with a grim, determined energy. The P-38 seconds were pulled from the flight line, their massive engine cowlings removed to expose the intricate guts of the Allison power plants. Working from freshly printed technical orders, the mechanics began the painstaking process. It was brutal, delicate work. They had to carefully tap into the main glycol coolant lines. A single slip could drain the engine of its lifeblood or send a scalding spray of toxic fluid across the hangar. They threaded the new ducts through impossibly tight spaces, their knuckles scraping against sharp metal edges. They mounted the new control levers in the cockpit, rigging the cables with the precision of a watchmaker. Every rivet had to be perfect. Every clamp had to be torqued to exact specifications. They were not just installing parts, they were instilling faith wrench by wrench into the heart of a machine that had betrayed its pilots. For the pilots watching from the sidelines, it was a period of agonizing suspense. They saw the work, they heard the promises, but the icy tendrils of fear were hard to shake. But then the first modified P-38G was ready. A veteran test pilot, a man who knew the Lightning's every vice, climbed into the cockpit. The ground crews gathered their faces, etched with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He taxied, took off, and began to climb. He didn't level off at 2,000 feet. He kept going. 25,000, 28,000. He pushed past 3,000 feet into the lethal altitude where so many engines had died. On the ground, they listened to his voice over the radio, calm, steady, and then filled with a sense of awe. "She's holding steady," he reported. "Smooth as glass. All needles are in the green." He pushed the throttles forward. The P-38, instead of shuddering, surged with a guttural roar of newfound power. The devil had been tamed. That single, successful test flight shattered the psychological dam. The news spread through the fighter groups with the speed and intensity of a lightning strike. Fear was cauterized, replaced by a surge of raw, aggressive confidence. The weapon they had been promised had finally been delivered. And with this new reliability came a complete radical revolution in aerial combat tactics. The fix did more than just prevent engine failure. It unlocked the P-38's true terrifying potential. Commanders, now certain their fighters could not only reach but dominate the high frontier, rewrote their entire doctrine. The P-38 was no longer just another escort fighter struggling to stay with the bombers. It became the top cover, the high-altitude sentinel. P-38 groups would now climb to altitudes far above the main bomber stream and the other escorts like the P-47 seconds. They became the wolves on the ridge, an overwatch of predators soaring at 35000 feet, looking down on the unfolding battle below. From this celestial perch they held all the cards. They could see the German fighters assembling miles away, dots of black against the clouds, long before the enemy knew they were there. The Luftwaffe pilots climbing to engage the bombers were now the ones at a disadvantage. They were fighting gravity, their engines straining at the edge of their performance envelope, completely oblivious to the doom that awaited them from above. The P-38 pilots would pick their targets, roll their fighters over and dive. With the full power of their reliable Allisons and the force of gravity, they would plummet like meteors, their 8 nose-mounted guns, a devastating concentration of firepower, converging on a single point. It was a tactic the Germans had no answer for. They would strike, shatter an enemy formation, and then use the P-38's incredible energy retention and now dependable power to zoom climb straight back up to their perch, ready to strike again. The very maneuver that had once been suicide was now their signature move. The hunter had become the hunted. The broken angel was not just flying again, it had ascended reborn as a god of the high, cold blue. The proof was not forged in the sterile, frozen confines of a Californian test chamber, but in the savage, three-dimensional crucible of combat 30,000 feet above the enemy. The newly modified P-38 seconds returned to the high-altitude escort missions not with cautious optimism, but with the pent-up fury of caged predators finally unleashed. The pilots, armed with a newfound, almost religious faith in their machines, were no longer just flying to survive the climb, they were climbing to hunt. And the Luftwaffe, smugly secure in its knowledge of the Lightning's fatal weakness, was about to be brutally, violently re-educated. The first encounters were nothing short of a massacre. Imagine the scene from the cockpit of a veteran German ace, an expert in Jagdgeschwader 2. He's leading his swarm of Focke-Wulf 190 seconds on a textbook attack against a box of B-17 seconds. He sees the escort P-47 seconds below and far above the familiar distinctive silhouettes of the P-38 seconds. He smiles. He knows the game. Lure them into a climbing fight, watch their engines choke and sputter, and then pick them off as they wallow helpless. He signals his wingmen and peels off, pulling his FW-190 into a steep, confident climb, a maneuver that has been a death sentence for countless Lightnings before. But this time, the game had changed. The P-38 seconds don't struggle. They don't falter. Instead of trying to evade, the lead American fighter meets his climb head-on, its twin booms seeming to pull it skyward with an unnatural ferocity. The German pilot's confidence wavers, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This isn't right. The P-38 continues to close the distance, climbing with him, matching his every move in the vertical plane. The Predator has refused to play the victim. Before the German ace can process this tactical impossibility, the Lightning above him rolls over its silver wings, blotting out the Sunday. It is no longer climbing, it is diving from a position of absolute superiority he never thought it could attain. The attack is not a desperate deflection shot, but a clinical, controlled execution, a torrent of fire, the infamous buzzsaw of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a single devastating 20mm cannon rips through the thin air. The German's wingman, who was following his leader's ascent, simply disintegrates in a flash of orange flame and black smoke. The German ace, his mind reeling in shock, breaks away in a desperate dive. As he glances back, the true horror dawns on him. The P-38 that just destroyed his comrade isn't limping or struggling. It has already converted its diving speed back into altitude, effortlessly climbing back to its perch, a silent, deadly sentinel, reclaiming the ceiling of the sky. This scene was repeated across the front. The Luftwaffe was thrown into utter chaos. Their tactical doctrine, built for years on the known performance limitations of their enemies, was rendered instantly obsolete. In debriefings, German pilots spoke with a mixture of terror and disbelief, insisting they had encountered a new type of American fighter. "It has the shape of a Lightning one," frantic report read, "but it climbs like a devil." Luftwaffe intelligence was baffled. Gun camera footage clearly showed standard P-38 G and H models. There were no visible modifications, no new wings, no different fuselage. It was the same monster, but somehow its soul had been replaced. They were fighting a ghost, a familiar shape inhabited by an unfamiliar and terrifying new spirit. This profound confusion cost them dearly, as pilots continued to employ tactics that led them directly into the jaws of the reborn American fighter. The numbers told the story in cold, stark reality. Before the winterization, Kit's P-38 groups in England were struggling to maintain a positive kill-to-loss ratio. In the months following the mass, retrofitting the change was seismic. The 55th Fighter Group, one of the first to be fully equipped with the modified Lightnings, saw its victory tallies skyrocket. Their kill ratio against the formidable F-FO 190 seconds and BF 109 seconds jumped to a staggering 5-to-1 then 7-to-1-inch high-altitude engagements. The rate of non-combat losses due to mechanical failure, once the group's biggest killer, plummeted from a crippling 50% on some missions to less than 5%. This was the dawn of the American aces in the European theatre. Pilots like Colonel Robin Olds, a man whose aggressive spirit was perfectly matched to the P-38's newfound capabilities, began carving a fearsome reputation. Flying his P-38 Scat Olds and his contemporaries in the 20th and 78th Fighter Groups demonstrated the awesome potential of the top cover tactic. They became the undisputed kings of the stratosphere. The bomber crews, who had once dreaded the sight of a faltering Lightning, now looked up and saw them as their guardian angels, their avenging swords held high against the heavens. The return of the P-38 to the high-altitude fight didn't just add another fighter to the roster, it fundamentally changed the geometry of the air war. The chain that had shackled the American long-range escort force had been shattered. The ghost was not only banished, its power had been harnessed, turned back against its creators, and unleashed upon an unsuspecting enemy with apocalyptic force. The stunning reversal of fortune in the skies over Germany was far more than a collection of individual dogfights. It was the first tremor of a strategic earthquake that would crack the very foundations of the Third Reich. The confusion and terror felt by that lone Luftwaffe ace, multiplied across hundreds of sorties, cascaded upwards through the chain of command, leaving German high command grappling with a phantom they couldn't comprehend. The tactical problem of the P-38 had been solved. The strategic weapon of the P-38 was about to be unleashed, and its impact would be felt not just in the air, but on the beaches of Normandy and in the heart of Berlin. The resurrected Lightning became a critical linchpin in the single most important aerial campaign of the war, the combined bomber offensive. The relentless daylight bombing raids by the 8th Air Force were not merely about destroying ball-bearing plants and aircraft factories. They were a deliberate, brutal strategy to bleed the Luftwaffe white. The goal was to force the German fighter arm to come up and fight day after agonizing day until it was attrited into oblivion. Before its rebirth, the P-38 had been a weak link in this chain. Now it was a tempered steel blade. The ability of P-38 groups to establish top cover changed the entire dynamic of the air war. They created a celestial high ground, a kill zone from which they could dictate the terms of engagement. This forced the Luftwaffe into an impossible choice. Either stay low and allow the bombers to pass unmolested, or climb up through the protective screen of P-47 seconds and P-51 seconds into the killing fields of the waiting Lightnings. Either way, they lost. Day by day, the cream of the Luftwaffe, the veteran Experten, was systematically ground down against this multi-layered, now impenetrable American escort shield. This war of attrition in the stratosphere was the essential prerequisite for Operation Overlord. Air superiority was not a luxury for the D-Day landings. It was the absolute non-negotiable condition for success. Without control of the skies, the Allied invasion fleet would have been savaged by German bombers, and the troops storming the beaches would have been strafed and bombed into annihilation by the likes of the WWII. The successful modification of the P-38 was one of the decisive factors that guaranteed this superiority. By returning a formidable long-range, high-altitude fighter to the fray, the Allies could intensify the pressure, chase the Luftwaffe all the way back to its own airfields, and systematically destroy it in the air and on the ground. When the ramps dropped on the morning of June 6, 1944, The American, British and Canadian soldiers looked up into a sky filled with the reassuring sight of Allied fighter bombers, not the terrifying shadow of the Luftwaffe. That clear sky, that critical umbrella of protection, was paid for in part by the engineers in Burbank and forged by the mechanics on the muddy fields of England who had breathed life back into the fork-tailed devil. The story of the P-38's redemption is also a damning indictment of the German war machine's own philosophy in the later stages of the war. It highlights a fundamental strategic divergence between the American and German approaches to technological warfare. The American approach, embodied by the winterization kit, was one of pragmatic, rapid, and relentless evolution. The military-industrial complex operated as a vast, responsive organism. It identified a critical flaw based on real-time feedback from the battlefield, threw its immense engineering resources at the problem, and deployed a good enough solution at a speed and scale the Axis could no longer fathom. The solution wasn't a revolutionary new aircraft. It was a clever, cost-effective modification that made an existing mass-produced weapon exponentially more lethal. It was a strategic masterstroke, disguised as a field modification, a testament to an industrial culture that valued practical results over theoretical perfection. America was a forge, constantly taking its existing swords, identifying their weaknesses, and hammering them into stronger, deadlier forms in the heat of battle. In stark contrast, Germany was becoming a museum of futuristic, flawed prototypes. While American engineers were perfecting the piston engine fighters they already had, German designers were pursuing wonder weapons, Wunderwaffen, seeking a single revolutionary breakthrough to reverse the tide of the war. They poured resources into weapons like the Me-262 jet fighter, a machine that was on paper untouchable. Yet it was a strategic dead end. It arrived too late in too few numbers and was plagued by its own catastrophic engine reliability issues, a bitter irony given the problem the Americans had just solved. The German war economy was a fortress brilliantly designed, but crumbling from within, unable to adapt or efficiently produce the solutions it desperately needed. They were so focused on designing the perfect sword for tomorrow's war that they failed to sharpen the blades they needed to survive today's. The Americans fixed their fighters with new ductwork. The Germans were trying to win the war with blueprints. Ultimately, the lesson of the P-38 Lightning is one of the most profound of the Second World War. It proves that victory is not always the product of a singular brilliant invention that changes everything overnight. More often, it is the cumulative result of 1,000 smaller victories of adaptation, of listening, and of the relentless pursuit of improvement. The feedback loop, the sacred unbroken chain of information flowing from the pilot in the cockpit, through the intelligence officers, back to the engineers, and finally returning to the front lines in the form of a solution, was America's true secret weapon. It was this ability to learn under fire, to admit a flaw, and then mobilize an entire nation to fix it, that defined the Allied path to victory. The P-38 began its European career as a symbol of American technological hubris, a beautiful but fragile machine that failed its pilots when they needed it most. It ended the war as a symbol of American industrial genius and resilience, a testament to a system that could turn its most glaring failures into its most decisive strengths. It was a machine that had been to hell and back, and in its fiery rebirth, it not only saved itself, but helped clear the path for the liberation of a continent. The ghost in the machine was vanquished not by building a new machine, but by having the wisdom and the will to understand and heal the one they already had. The final chapter of the P-38 Lightning's story in Europe is not one of dramatic revolutionary change, but of quiet, lethal dominance. The war machine, once healed of its critical flaw, became an embodiment of relentless American power. The same fighter that had once been a liability became a cornerstone of Allied air supremacy, a constant, menacing presence in the skies that the Luftwaffe could no longer effectively challenge. Its journey from a flawed prodigy to a seasoned killer stands as a powerful testament to one of the most crucial yet often overlooked elements of modern warfare, the art of adaptation. The P-38 Lightning was never designed in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of combat, its weaknesses exposed by the harsh realities of a determined enemy and a brutal environment. Its ultimate triumph was not a victory for its original design, but a victory for the system that refused to let it fail. It showcases a military-industrial philosophy that was agile, responsive, and deeply connected to the experiences of the men on the front lines. The voices of pilots like Lieutenant Miller echoing from their cockpits in the frozen stratosphere were not lost in the bureaucracy. They became the catalysts for an incredible engineering race against time. This feedback loop from battlefield failure to laboratory solution and back to battlefield dominance was the engine that drove the Allied war effort, a relentless cycle of improvement that the Axis, for all its engineering brilliance, could not match. In the grand narrative of World War II, filled with tales of revolutionary technologies like the atomic bomb and the jet engine, the story of the P-38's winterization kit might seem like a minor footnote, but its significance is far greater. It reminds us that wars are often won not by the side with the most advanced weapon on paper, but by the side that can most effectively perfect and deploy the weapons it already possesses. The Lightning saga is a profound lesson in the power of incremental evolutionary improvement. It is a story not of a single eureka moment, but of the gritty, unglamorous work of problem-solving under immense pressure. Today, as the roar of piston engines has been replaced by the scream of jets, the legacy of the reborn fork-tailed devil endures. It serves as a timeless reminder that the most sophisticated technology is useless if it cannot be adapted to the unpredictable realities of conflict. The true measure of a nation's military strength lies not only in its ability to innovate, but in its capacity to listen, to learn, and to evolve. The P-38 Lightning, once a symbol of a promise unfulfilled, ultimately became a symbol of a promise, kept a promise to its pilots that they would be given the tools they needed to fight, to win, and to come home. It was a victory of pragmatism over perfection, a triumph of resilience that helped clear the skies over Europe and hasten the end of the war.